has come together, the Rwanda bill has passed. It's now time for the Lords to pass this bill too.
So our big question this morning, how can we protect Britain at home and abroad?
Defence Secretary Grant Shapps is with us to answer that question. How would Yvette Cooper, who wants to be Labour's Home Secretary, manage the risks at home? And in the latest of our election year interviews, the First Minister of Scotland claims he knows what's going to happen.
It is undoubtedly the case that
Morning. Welcome to you and welcome to my trio at the desk with me today. Simon Reeve, the intrepid explorer who's been travelling around the world making TV for more than 20 years, lucky for some. Conservative peer, Baroness Nicky Morgan, who was in the cabinet for many years, and businessman, multi-millionaire and philanthropist Sir Tom Hunter. A very warm welcome to all three of you today. Let's start with what is making the news. The BBC and mistresses who lost so much but who died before their claims were resolved. But it leads with the risk to kids from measles. Let's have a word with our panel before we speak to the Defence Secretary. Great to have you all with us. Nicky, first of all, you were in Cabinet for a long time. When you have a situation like this, where tensions are visibly bubbling up in such distressing ways, far from home, what does that feel like as a politician trying to grapple with it?
Well, good morning. I think it sort of has a shadow over everything else, really, because, of course, every domestic issue is extremely important, and that's what those cabinet ministers with domestic portfolios are focused on. But I think it sort of almost compares, and perhaps you understand that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, are very distracted by what's happening around the world, because, of course, when you've got that great uncertainty, actually, it sort of everything pales into insignificance, I guess.
So it kind of casts a shadow. I mean, Sir Tom, you've run lots of different businesses over many years. When you have this kind of instability, what kind of effect does it have?
Well, I mean, entrepreneurs, what we've got to do is just get on with it. We like to worry about the things we can control. We have absolutely no control over these things. But it seems to me the geopolitical risk in the world today is the highest it's ever been in my lifetime. Really?
You feel that?
I do.
And when you're making decisions then about whether or not to invest, whether or not to spend money, does it cause hesitation? Or if you look at what's happened to supply chains?
Well, it's something to take into consideration. But again, I say business people worry about the things we can control and get on with it.
Now, Simon, you've travelled to many of the countries where we now see instability and causes for concern, but you're also one of the first people to write about Osama bin Laden. I suppose one of the problems with all of this is the roots of these dilemmas go back such a long time.
Such a long time, and they haven't been addressed or resolved. So yes, I think it's interesting what you're saying, Tom, about, I think you're right. I think this is a very dangerous moment. Comparable perhaps to that period before the start of the First World War even. And by that I mean things can go a peaceful way, or there can just be one small incident that erupts all of us into a much more catastrophic situation even than we've got now.
And do you really feel that with all your experience going to different countries?
I think if we look back in history, we can see it can just be small incidents that create chaos. The First World War was started just by one guy, wasn't it? When the Archduke took a wrong turn and is shot. So these terrible world events can be created and sparked by small incidents. And we've got a lot of those small incidents underway at the moment.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk to the Defence Secretary about. And last week, you'll remember, the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, told us that he found it hard to remember a more dangerous world. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Well, let's see what our trio at the desk made of those two interviews, and let's stick with the Middle East. Nicky, you heard there Humza Yousaf's very strong views that Palestinians are simply not regarded in the same way that we look at Israelis. But also Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, saying that Benjamin Netanyahu's position against a two-state solution is disappointing. What can the UK government actually do to try to shift that? Because they believe it's a stumbling block, but yet they don't seem very able to do anything about it.
Well, I thought it was fascinating that actually Grant Shapps was quite so clear, and people might think disappointing is not a strong word, but actually coming from the UK Defence Secretary against a statement made by an overseas Prime Minister, I think that is pretty strong. I think the UK has to work in the UN multilaterally with our allies, with countries such as the US. I think the Foreign Secretary David Cameron has visited Israel. No doubt there will be further visits, many behind-the-scenes conversation. But I think probably, I'd like to think, most of Westminster would be disappointed, at least by Benjamin Netanyahu's comments, because I think the two-state solution has to be the only way, or one of the only ways, out of the current difficulties seen. And as Simon was saying earlier on, what we've seen happen in Israel and Gaza, the worry is, of course, it spreads to other countries unintentionally.
And Simon, you've spent a lot of time, all over the world, but in that region too. How is the West's pronouncement sort of viewed? Does it matter what America's saying? Does it matter what the UK says?
I'm not convinced it matters what the UK says. It certainly matters what America says. If anyone has any influence over the Israelis in this situation, it is the States. But, of course, the President Biden thinks that his hands are somewhat tied. I think he would be more able to do more than he actually is. But that's not to say that the Americans haven't been involved for decades. They have. They've done more than anyone to try and take these two sides to the negotiating table and to some sort of agreement. It's not a good situation. It really isn't. And we can sit here and we can talk in rational terms about people discussing and coming to negotiations, etc. But there are some real extremists on both sides in this situation. I think we don't quite recognise the depths of the fury, the anger, the rage, the hatred, and the nuttery, frankly, that exists in this situation as well. I'm really worried about the chances for the two-state solution. I think it's almost been driven out of being a possibility over the last few decades by the endless settlement and settlers in the West Bank. How on earth will they create a functioning two-state solution? But I agree, what other possibility is there? What other solution is there to this? But I absolutely promise everyone that unless we resolve this, unless we absolutely take real care and concern about this, this has the ability and the potential to detonate a wider situation, not just in the Middle East, but one that will affect us all.
We're going to talk about Humza Yousaf in a second, Tom, but I just wondered, were you more or less reassured having listened to Grant Shapps?
Oh, goodness, reassured listening to politicians, Laura. I don't know about reassured. It's obviously not my specialist subject, but coming to it as an amateur, what other solution could there be? The right for Palestinians to have their own country, the right for Israel to have secure borders. That is common sense. This is the time for political leadership to really come to the fore. And I'm worried about the quality of political leadership around the world to come up with these solutions.
Well, let's then talk about your part of the world where there are worries about the quality of the political leadership. Humza Yousaf we spoke to at length this week, and I think it is fair to say, we talked to pollsters, he's not yet seen by many people as a really compelling leader. He's not sort of been able to take the situation by the scruff of the neck. Fair to say also he's inherited a very difficult situation in Scotland. But what did you think of how he positioned himself today with this claim again and again, Keir Starmer is inevitably going to be Prime Minister, so you can vote SNP? Yeah,
well, goodness me, a political leader saying that an opposition party is definitely going to be Prime Minister of the UK. I don't think I've ever heard that before. But let's start with what I agree with Humza on. Don't worry, it's a short list. So we would both agree that we want our country, Scotland, to grow and flourish. But then we disagree how we're going to do it. Let's be clear, governments don't make wealth in a country. Business people, entrepreneurs, hardworking individuals who are out there striving create the wealth. Governments should create an environment in which that can happen, and then they decide to tax us and spend our money, and we have a chance every 4 or 5 years to decide if they're doing a good job or not. And this is where I believe 16 years of the same government in Scotland is far too long. That's not a political statement.
And our audience should know you've never said what side you're on in the independence debate, so you're not coming from one particular side or another.
I've never been a member of a political party, and I never will be. My wife wouldn't allow it. But what we believe in is we believe in entrepreneurs and businesses being allowed to thrive, to create the jobs, and we believe in our foundation the best social policy ever written is a decent paid job. And what's happening in Scotland, as I believe, is the government believes they know best, but the facts are not with them. We have got a ferry contract that the government's taken over that's going to cost the Scottish taxpayer 300 million. We've got a deposit return scheme which was put in by people with no business experience. It's going to cost 50 million. How many nurses, how many teachers, how many policemen could that pay for?
But when we asked him your question about the extra taxation for the wealthy, he made the point, look, suck it up, because that pays for free tuition, it pays for free prescriptions. So what did you think of his answer to your question?
Yeah, so we agree again that the people with the broadest shoulders should carry the heaviest burden. Absolutely. But that is happening in Scotland. 11% of the Scottish taxpayers, of which I'm one, pay 65% of the whole income tax collected in Scotland. So the people with the broadest shoulders are carrying the heaviest burden. Where we absolutely disagree is that I want more wealth creators. I want more people in Scotland starting and growing their businesses. We did a investigation with Oxford Economics about the Irish. And Ireland is going to run a 60 billion surplus over the next 3 years. Scotland's going to run a 30 billion deficit.
And you think Scotland could take lessons from Ireland?
I think let's create more. And we don't get that by having 6 different bands of income tax. That's double what we have here in England. And that is ridiculous. And the people in the Scottish business community who I listen to, they don't believe this government has their back, and that is a very bad situation.
OK, well, it's interesting to put your question to him, to hear his response and to hear your response. I want to just briefly touch on Rwanda. So Nicky, Grant Shapps said it has to go through. He thinks the Lords absolutely has to pass it. Will you let it through? Your Lords, Rishi Sunak said this week, it's the will of the people. You have to get on with it.
Well, I hesitate to speak on the whole behalf of the whole House of Lords, but I was sorry that Grant didn't take your bet, because I think the bill will go through the House of Lords. I would just say to number 10 that the last Prime Minister who used the will of the people language, it wasn't a happy precedent. I think with the House of Lords, the thing to do is to give it time. It is a scrutinising chamber. There's lots of people, lawyers, diplomats, others, who rightly will say, are you sure about this? Do you want to let it through? But ultimately, that is what a scrutinising chamber is about. But we are very clear, we are not the elected chamber, and therefore, actually, if the government wants this to go through, I think ultimately it will.
But the political push from Rishi Sunak is not something that you appreciate, I think you're saying diplomatically.
I think if you put the House of Lords, in my experience, I've only been there for just over 4 years, if you put the House of Lords under too much pressure and sort of try to... there are no timetable motions in the House of Lords, so you don't do what the House of Commons does in terms of sort of truncating debate. So if you actually allow them to talk, to debate, to scrutinise, to say, are you sure you want to do this? I think overall they will get the result they want in number 10.
So you'll do it in your own sweet time, I think you're saying.
I think that's right.
Simon, just briefly, what do you think of the Rwanda policy? You spent a lot of time in Africa.
Goodness. I think it's a gimmick. I think it's designed to appeal to voters rather than to actually affect actual change. But I would step back slightly from it as an issue and say, I don't think we talk about enough about what are we trying to achieve? What is our ultimate game or target with this, or on the migration issue in the round? For me personally, my principal issue and desire is to make poorer countries a bit wealthier, that our brothers and sisters out there on planet Earth live better, more fulfilling lives. I do not think that is achieved necessarily by mass migration. I think mass migration is a bit of a racket in many ways. And I think too often people on the left don't see it for what it is, which is often, in my view, what I see is us as wealthy countries poaching, nicking and nabbing clever, bright, wonderful people from poorer countries, bringing them over to work as pizza delivery people and as courier drivers. I don't necessarily think that helps them. It certainly doesn't always help their countries. I'm in too many countries where up to 90% of the university-educated professionals have left.
It's an interesting aspect of the conversations, maybe not talked about that much in Westminster and in this country. Just before we move on, briefly, we've talked a lot on this programme and we spoke at length to Michelle Mone just before Christmas. Tom, you're somebody who knows her. I think you were actually one of her original investors.
I was.
Now, this has all turned into a pretty big mess. She's under investigation. I don't want you to talk about a criminal inquiry. And, she has said she lied about what happened, but they deny doing anything wrong in terms of the deal they did. What do you think about what's happened to her, knowing her when you did as a young businesswoman?
Yeah, so, I mean, we helped Michelle in her early days, and one of the key aims of our foundation is we help hundreds of companies in Scotland start and grow. But what I think happened, let's put it in context. When the pandemic hit, there was no one person in the world knew how to deal with it, because there wasn't a living soul who'd lived through a pandemic. And therefore, the government, in my opinion, panicked. But I understand the panic, and there wasn't enough PPE. And there was this VIP-ing, which probably in paper looked okay. So who can help us get this? But then it turns out it's friends of government ministers who went down, who maybe hadn't made this thing in the past.
But do you think she's been treated fairly? She's very clear that she's been made a scapegoat. And do you look at her, at what's happened to her, and think it's just a terribly sad mess, but she may have made mistakes? What do you think?
I think she's her own worst enemy. I think she has, in her interview with yourself, you know, it was a car crash interview. Why did she decide to do it? You must be very persuasive. But she is not the only one who benefited. If I had been running the government, which thank God I'm not, I would have said, can you help us? But I'm putting a cap on the profits you can make, because there's something above profit here. Our country is in dire straits. We need your help as entrepreneurs, but let's cap the profit you can make.
All right, well, hindsight might be a
I think it's
wonderful
staggering
thing.
how people sought to profit in that situation. What does it say about society?
Well, there's a lot of conversation about that, and a lot of it we've had in this studio. All three, thank you so much for now. We'll be back with you at the end of the show. And of course, remember, you can tell us what you think. Send in, well, brief word, Nicky. I could see you were animatedly wondering about what Yvette Cooper had said.
Yeah, well, I was wondering just obviously about Yvette Cooper, but also the commission that I was chairing.
Well, indeed. Well, we're going to talk about the COVID Commission, which is one of the things that you've taken up since you left the House of Commons. There is now going to be a COVID Memorial Day. Tell us what the plan is.
Yeah, look, just very briefly, I was asked to chair the UK Commission on COVID commemoration to remember lives lost, the sacrifices people made who worked through it, the contribution of UK science. Marie Curie have taken up the first recommendation, which is to have a National Day of Reflection, which will be on the first Sunday of March, this year the 3rd of March. Details at dayofreflection.org.uk. And I think it's an important period. Of course, for many people it's past, but for many people watching, they will be living with the loss of a loved one, or even long COVID, or just things that they weren't able to do for a period of time.
And Tom, what do you feel about the COVID inquiry? We've seen this week all sorts of embarrassments of things that were going on in the Scottish Government at the time.
So what do we want from our politicians, Laura? We want honesty, we want competence, and we want accountability. Throughout the COVID inquiry, we have seen none of that.
You feel that?
I mean, our former First Minister said, of course, she would share every piece of information, including WhatsApps, and then all of a sudden, the WhatsApps have disappeared.
Well, there have been lots of mysterious cases of disappearing WhatsApps. And then Nicola Sturgeon put out a slightly contradictory statement yesterday. So it's a bit of a mystery to be untangled. Let's close our conversations this morning, however, with something enjoyable and fun to look forward to. Simon, you are back on the TV tonight with your latest series of Wilderness. We can show people some amazing pictures of you crossing what looks like endless icy wastes in Patagonia. Tell us about it. What's your favourite bit?
A reminder, I think, that there is still a beautiful, magnificent planet out there. Despite everything we have and are doing to destroy it stupidly, there is a planet worth believing in and fighting for. And these wilderness areas, they matter to us. These places matter to us. We are connected to one ecosystem on this planet. And we need to recognise that the billions of trees in the heart of the Congo rainforest, for example, are an integral part of the ecosystem on which we all depend. So underlying the jolly adventure and the blisters and everything else in the programmes, there is, I hope, that message as well, that wildernesses matter to us and they do still exist.
And that jolly adventure did nearly go quite badly wrong. Is it true a lion tried to get into your tent?
I don't think it was trying to get in. It was trying to lick some moisture off the side of my tent. But there were a few moments like that, yes, because when you step out, when you get into those wild places, unpredictable stuff happens and you have to react to it as best you can. And we accepted that as part of the adventure and experience. But yes, there are I'm getting slightly sweaty palms at the memory of that moment. That was a very scary moment in my little tent on my own.
OK, well, we're very pleased that the line didn't get you.
No
Thank you
nibbling, yeah.
all for joining us in the political jungle
Thank
here in
you.
our studio this morning. Wilderness is on BBC Two, I think, tonight, and
BBC Two tonight,
iPlayer.
9
Don't
PM.
miss that, because they've been huge hits previously, and I'm sure the latest series will be great
Thank
too.
you.
Thank you all three very much for being with us this morning. Thank you, obviously, for watching.